I want to speak directly to the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room that I perceive is I'm in Liechtenstein, slowly making my way to Davos. Liechtenstein has become something of a commuter village, if you will, commuter country for Davos, but looking forward to seeing Dave and everyone else in person tomorrow at the event. Change of scenery, Peter, change of scenery. Let's not use the V word. I mean, I've covered in my newsletter, The Innermost Loop, how in some cases in China, for example, the Chinese government feels that there is such an overabundance of humanoid robotics companies that they're taking regulatory measures to limit the competition. I do think, and I've made the point on this pod in the past, that the AI compute is going to march right out of the data centers. And I think CES 2026, with Jensen's talk, with all the humanoid robots on the floor, I think we're seeing that in process. I think we're seeing the physical world start to become fodder for the AI revolution. And isn't this exactly the sort of singularity that you were hoping for? Well, it's not a Cambrian explosion if we're going to follow the metaphor properly and accurately, if we don't see an explosion of different body plans as well, Salim.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I would say, I mean, in defense of the hand companies, A, hands are hard. B, we don't know what a mature version of the humanoid or non-humanoid robotics industry looks like. We don't know if it's going to stay vertically integrated or if it'll move to a more horizontal stratification, in which case maybe a dedicated hand company makes some sort of economic sense. Yes and no. My 2 cents on this would be there's a value in compliance-oriented spaces such as driverless autonomy to capturing a march of the nines where you need to capture really long tail events, the crazy things that happen in the road in front of a driver, and simply scraping YouTube or paying drivers to collect lots of video data or lots of paired video action data won't capture that long tail of extremely rare but extremely important events. But on the other hand, I think NVIDIA's strategy here with Cosmos and with Alpha Mayo of doing what Intel back in its glorier days used to do, which is commodifying its complement, providing optimized software SDKs to encourage everyone to build on top of their stack. It's exactly what NVIDIA should be doing. It commoditizes their complement and makes their hardware that much more valuable. And in the case of like Cosmos and Alpha Mayo, it's encouraging everyone, especially probably Chinese OEMs and maybe unconventional OEMs, to go build Tesla FSD competitors. And it's great for NVIDIA's business.
But my point being...
You see what Jensen did there, right? Vera is the CPU and Rubin is the GPU. It's very interesting in light of the history of the attempted ARM acquisition. I think what we're seeing here is the emergence of NVIDIA as a vertically integrated hardware provider. It's not just about providing the GPUs anymore. Now it's about providing the full tamale, probably extending upward to providing the full data center. I've written almost every day about how the memory shortage being created by AI infra deployment is sucking all the oxygen out of the PC space. It's going to become, if present trends continue, completely uneconomical to buy souped up local PCs because of largely memory shortages, DRAM shortages being created by the GPUs that are, of course, all going into the cloud and not into the client. So I think what we're seeing with Vera Rubin, successor architecture, of course, to Blackwell and predecessor to Feynman, is that CPU plus GPU plus memory plus interconnect plus all the housing, all of this is going to be packaged up into the new form factor of computing, which, by the way, is no longer smartphones, it's not smart glasses, it's not PCs, it's a data center. That is the new form factor of de facto computing on this planet.
Crazy.
So much for hyperdeflation on the client. Could very well happen. I mean, I think it's a function of latency, and thank goodness that Starlink is becoming more broadly available because you're going to want both low latency communications and high broadband communication with the cloud. But as with everything, it's only a phase until we see a lot of humanity uploaded into the cloud, at which point we won't be asking that question anymore.
Alex,
and also, like, Salim, let's turn it on its face. Why can't you be local to the compute?
I could be.
It's a trick question because, as with the singularity, I don't think there's a single point in time. I think it's a process that's spread out over a number of years. I'd like to think the process has already started in some form because a lot of my writing is available now online, and an entrepreneurial reader can feed all of my writings to a model and ask it to do a low fidelity reconstruction of me already. Is that an upload of me? Arguably, it's a very low fidelity upload of me in some form.
Well, then they were
When
all
will I get
uploaded before.
to some low extent? The salvaged version of the question I would ask myself is, when will an ultra high fidelity upload of myself exist? And it's still a trick question because that's probably a destructive process for the next 10 years. So non-destructive scan of my brain, I would be very disappointed if that doesn't happen in the next 5 to 10 years. Destructive upload of my brain with Kurzweilian or Moraveckian nanorobots in my bloodstream, certainly hope that that's happening like maximum 10 to 20 years.
Okay.
I hope.
The irony here is so delicious you could cut it with a knife. I'm reminded of course, Robert Solo's economist famous quote about productivity everywhere except in the statistics, which was at the time, of course, in reference to the fact that the IT boom of the 1970s and 1980s was seemingly not showing up in macroeconomic statistics. And this direction from McKinsey has me wondering, are we going to redefine per capita productivity to include agents as heads, as per capita, in order to artificially suppress productivity growth? It seems like as we start to treat humans and agents as being more fungible heads in an economy, that could be a way in which what would otherwise be a productivity explosion deriving from the intelligence explosion create a false sensation that we're not going through a productivity boom. That's the more ironic take. The less ironic take would be, no, of course we're going to move to zero human companies, and that's where the real productivity boom comes from.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to move.
I think, Salim, you're pointing to the job of the future, adult daycare, to take away your children. Yeah, I think the zeitgeist is that over the holidays, over the New Year's holiday, many in the tech world started playing with the combination, seriously, with the combination of Claude Code plus Opus 4.5 that some have started calling Clopus for the first time seriously. And Clopus is incredible. It, as we've discussed on the pod in past, it pushes the boundaries on the meter benchmark for autonomy time horizons, and that makes all the difference in the world. And by the way, it's not just Clopus. We're starting to see similar effects with GPT 5.2 Codex, which is also specifically designed to push large autonomy horizons with many action calls in sequence together. And I think this is an inflection point. Some are calling it AGI. I think that's nonsense, because I would argue we've had some form of generality, regardless of how, as we've quibbled in past over what AGI itself means. We've had arguably some form of generality for now the past 5.5 or so years, but there's an inflection point of some sort that's been reached. Caveat, every point on an exponential curve feels like a knee, and almost a hyper exponential inflection point in terms of these autonomy horizons. And it's to the point where, if we've talked on the pod in the past about the AI 2027 forecast, there was an alternative forecast, a derivative of that. Rather than projecting autonomy time horizons would be exponential, projecting that they'd be hyper exponential, so an exponential of an exponential. And it looks, and I write about this every day, it looks like at this point more likely that that's the trend that we're on, specifically with Claude Code plus Opus 4.5 Clopus and GPT 5.2 Codex being able to accomplish absurd amounts of autonomy, like creating allegedly entire web browsers in Rust with functioning, allegedly, JavaScript engines from scratch. That would have taken years historically. So if this trend continues, I really do think these autonomy time horizons pushing from 5 hours to weeks to months to years, that is game changing. It's probably also worth adding, as we talk on the pod from time to time, about how Anthropic has seemingly made an implicit bet that programming and that code generation is the shortcut to recursive self-improvement, as opposed to, say, OpenAI's bet focusing on multiple modalities, image generation being the most prominent example, perhaps, or video generation. And to the extent that Clopus is looking like a quote-unquote watershed moment, that would seem to validate Dario's and Anthropic's bet on code generation in particular as the critical path to recursive self-improvement and more broadly to human labor substitution.
Yep.
I'll just add, I think it's the exact opposite. Sure, to some extent, yeah, okay, fine. I'll play the contrarian card because that's the easiest story to tell.
I think it's a great. Go for it.
So that the CRMs are already heavily customized. So already there was enormous pent-up demand for cheaper ways to customize, no code, customize existing applications. I think CRMs in particular, like Salesforce CRM, are already very low compliance substitutes for automated code gen from some of these models. But I think the point that everyone is missing is these companies have the same access to Claude Code and Opus and all of these frontier models that consumers or other enterprises who would purportedly go and create all of their own in-house substitutes for do. So I think, yes, on margin, of course, like I see the same stories everyone else sees that, here, $500,000 Salesforce CRM contract canceled in favor of bespoke, internally Claude Code generated CRM. Of course, that's going to happen on the margin, but in the meantime, everyone has access to the same weapons of mass superintelligence. And so I would say on a global basis, no, the market will find a new equilibrium. Ho-hum, nothing to see here.
Wait, I'd like to take the counterpoint. I want to take the...
All right, contrarian view time. So if you actually look at UCP, the Universal Commerce Protocol, this is a JavaScript-oriented protocol for e-commerce within an agentic conversation. That's all it is. I definitely come to me to advance the perspective that we're in the singularity and the end times, the good end times are imminent, all of that. This is not the end times. It's very exciting. Don't mistake my messaging regarding UCP, but it is not going to extinguish the web. It is a way to start to standardize. And I know one of the team leads on this program. It's very exciting. Make no mistake. It is a way to start to standardize e-commerce from within Gemini and other chat agents. That's all it is. Is it going to obliterate the web? Not at all. People do a lot of other things on the web, and people do a lot of shopping that's browsing oriented rather than conversationally oriented on the web. And if you're following the news from Amazon's buy it with an AI agent button, something of a controversy, there are also a lot of agents that are doing shopping on the web that probably will not be using UCP to do their own shopping. So I think this is part of the overall solution. I do not think it drives web extinction. I want to speak directly to the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room that I perceive is that the CapEx to the tune of trillions of dollars is enormous, and the CapEx to repay itself is going to require an enormous amount of revenue. And that revenue has to come from somewhere. Is it going to come from adding ads to consumer? Part of it can. I don't think that can be the complete story. So I think that the subtext here of trying to draw a parallel, almost a field of dreams style, if you build the compute, the revenue will come. I think the subtext is that both consumers and enterprises, and by the way, this comes up in every conversation, almost every conversation I have with my friends at various frontier labs, both consumers and enterprises are going to need to start consuming a lot more very expensive inference time compute in order to motivate all the CapEx. What does that look like? What does that look like? So it means consumers who, again, we haven't talked about this, as I recall, in depth on the pod to date. There was the whole, in the past year, OpenAI rolling out GPT-5 with reasoning on by default to consumers. What happened? For a while, it was great. Like, Wile E. Coyote runs off of the cliff and is now in midair, and it's great, and you're flying. And now we've turned on reasoning capabilities for 500 million people. It's amazing. What happens? Many of those people didn't actually use the reasoning capabilities and or decided that they didn't like the personality of an AI that could reason. And it was also very expensive and also maybe not
delay
paying
times.
for
And delay times, not available right now.
Yeah, and it takes a while. It's long latency to actually think. You want an instant, an instant response from
answer.
AI that's completely sycophantic to you.
Yes,
Who wants to wait for a non-sycophantic, thoughtful response? So what happens is you get consumers who aren't necessarily at this point willing to be force-fed reasoning. And then you have enterprises who are using reasoning, but the reasoning isn't transformative enough yet, or not yielding transformative enough outcomes to rationalize the tripling, the sustained tripling year over year of revenue. So what needs to happen to sum up the story is I think we're getting to the point where we're really going to start to need to see transformative applications popping out of reasoning in order to motivate continued year-over-year tripling of compute and revenue. We get that. The party can continue ad infinitum. I'll walk through, if I may, the names actually named on this slide. So Microsoft, arguably not a frontier lab. Like right now, it's not a frontier lab. We had the Mustafa discussion.
Same with Apple.
Arguably not a frontier. Similarly with Apple, not a frontier lab. So cross those two off. Google / Alphabet / DeepMind, I view as a frontier lab. I think everyone else would broadly agree, and I expect them to survive the next 3 years. Amazon, big question mark. They provide a lot of infra, but do they offer frontier models at offering frontier capabilities versus, say, more hyper efficient, smaller scale SLMs? No, arguably not a frontier lab in their present state. Meta, Llama 4, arguably a bit of a failure on the part of the organization, and they're trying with Nat Friedman, old friend of mine, and others, to put together vis-a-vis Meta Superintelligence Labs, a frontier lab, but at this point in time, not a frontier lab. Tesla arguably is a VLA frontier model vendor, but most consumers aren't in a position to consume VLAs yet. They will appreciate it once the March of the Humanoid Robots comes out, at which point the definition of a frontier lab may generalize from a lab that offers bleeding edge agentic chatbot experiences to offering humanoid robots, which actually parenthetically may mean that answering the question, how many frontier labs will survive in the next 3 years, the limiting factor is less which companies will physically survive and more which companies will be able to offer humanoid robots with vision, language, and action modalities in the next 3 years, which will be the redefinition of what frontier capabilities offer and not just agentic chat. So I expect OpenAI to offer humanoid robots. Anthropic, question mark. They're very focused on code gen and recursive self-improvement, but I expect them to survive and thrive in IPO. And XAI, it's very exciting interacting with Grok 4, or at least Grok, I should say, vis-a-vis FSD 14. Is it, Peter, 14.2.2?
Yes.
So yeah, in that sense, we're already halfway there. I doubt it. I think it's more a regulatory question than a technical question. I think a knockout blow of the type that I understand you to be describing, Peter, would require some sort of tremendous corporate reorganization that would look like a large-scale M&A that for the past few years, the U.S. government has generally looked unfavorably upon, even with acqui-hires. So I think it's unlikely that we'll see anything like that in the next 3 years, at least. I guess I'm saying more broadly, it seems unlikely that we would see a broad reorganization of the names listed here: Microsoft, Apple, Google DeepMind, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, OpenAI, Anthropic, and XAI, absent a Tesla XAI or SpaceX XAI combination, which I think absolutely could happen. Other than that, seems unlikely that the Justice Department would look favorably on a broad recombination of these entities. All right, so the headline is, we discussed in the predictions episode at the end of 2025, many of my predictions at the smaller scale were about AI being solved, or AI solving math. And not just AI solving math as a discipline, but AI bulk solving open math problems of high importance. And guess what? That's exactly what we're starting to see. We're seeing now several times per week well-known Erdős problems, or Erdős, famous Hungarian mathematician who was published very widely in the math community. Many people keep track of particular specifically numbered problems that open problems that Erdős identified. We're starting to see several times per week now, usually GPT 5.2 Pro, usually accompanied by a formalization tool like Harmonics Aristotle to perform verification, formalization plus verification of the solutions. We're starting to see the trickle and soon the flood of hard, open, valuable math problems get solved by AI. I predicted it. Others predicted it. The future is here. But I think critically, the question I always get asked is, so what? Why should the quote unquote average person care that AI is starting to bulk solve hard, open, valuable problems in math? I think the most important reason everyone should care is as I've said, with AI not remaining constrained to the data center and AI walking out of the data center in humanoid robot form, this bulk solving of everything is not going to stay confined to math. It's going to walk out of math into physics and chemistry and material science and biology and medicine and the humanities. All of these disciplines are going to get bulk solved by math. Math was the easiest starting point because the problems are straightforward to verify and straightforward to enumerate. But I think history will look back and recognize this moment when AI is starting to bulk solve open math problems as the inflection point when everything started to get solved by AI. That's my story.
Of course, you're
and
going to be
even
saying,
there, I don't sleep on the possibility that AI will generate those prompts as well, and AI will tell itself what problems to solve. Yeah. I'd say follow the money and follow the SRAM. This is in part, I think, an SRAM story. No one, we talked earlier in this episode about the difficulty of finding DRAM. Okay, so what does that leave? That leaves SRAM. And Cerebras, like Grok with a Q, which was hack-wired by NVIDIA for $20 billion. These are two of the most prominent players with SRAM accelerated compute. Their architectures are totally different other than the SRAM. Like Cerebras is focused on wafer scale computing and Grok with a Q is not. But they're both SRAM-oriented vendors. And if you're OpenAI and you're hungry for compute and you're hungry for diversification of compute sources, then having especially leading up to potential IPO this year, having a totally diversified portfolio of compute vendors that isn't necessarily in part subject to the whims of the DRAM market, having a few, arguably one of the largest SRAM independent accelerated compute vendors that's left post Hackwire of Grok with a Q, Cerebras, makes a world of sense. And what does that enable? It enables much higher throughput models. If you're OpenAI and you're now starting to get really excited about GPT 5.2 codecs with very long chains of thought with hundreds, maybe even thousands of tool calls, those tool calls are expensive in wall clock time. So you want to do this in a really high throughput, low latency way. And the way you do that is with SRAM architectures like Cerebras.
Yeah,
right,
just
also
to add a little.
My comment on it, and Elon is also at times referred to the concept of a quote unquote digital optimus. This idea of not a physical world humanoid robot that replaces physical human labor, but a purely virtual agent that replaces all knowledge work. I think this goes back to our discussion about dissolving SaaS and sort of all of SaaS being replaced in a dissolving into a puddle of generative AI. I think there's a need by all the frontier labs, including XAI, to come up with rational business strategies that motivate the CapEx. And one of the juiciest targets for revenue generation to motivate the CapEx is saying we're going to replace all enterprise software with generative AI, with macro hard software. That's the easiest target. I don't think it's the most imaginative target that XAI is going after, but it's one of the easiest and most legible stories to tell to capital market. Yeah, but what do you think the cost basis of SaaS software is? It's at least historically, it's the employees who are writing and operating the SaaS software. Yeah,
good.
Yeah. So the irony is, I think from time to time this subset of episodes gets called WTF. There's another WTF happened in 1971.com that explores the implications, for example, of energy policy in the US on macroeconomic growth and other input factors as well. I think part of the problem, and I do think this is a real problem, is the US has a history of sometimes being scared of energy and scared of nuclear energy in particular, sometimes perversely scared of solar energy, certainly from time to time scared of fossil fuel-based energy. And I think there is a moment that comes in time in a space race like what we're seeing with AI, where there are more important factors at stake than whether we're scared of a particular energy source or not.
What does that mean?
And I think Salim gestured at what being scared of solar photovoltaic could look like. There are various stories publicly reported about vulnerabilities discovered in power converters in connection with solar PV from Chinese supply chains. There are many ways that having a strong import dependency on solar PV could go wildly wrong. And I think one can paint a nightmare scenario for almost any energy source. Certainly, it's far easier with coal and the impact on human health. It's easy to paint a story for petroleum in general. But the reality is, if we get to superintelligence on the timescale of AI 2027 or anything remotely like that, that timescale is so fast relative to timescales associated with climate change or with health impacts at a macro scale, not a local scale, or risk in connection with 3 Mile Island Gen 1, never mind the fact that new fission plants are Gen 3 plus. There is so much that can happen on such a shorter timescale that I would argue, at least, superintelligence should be the driving factor here and not legacy concerns over particular energy types. Yeah, I think there are a few narratives here. One is we're tiling the Earth not just with compute, but also with solar photovoltaics and with nuclear and other energy sources. That's sort of the superficial story. The deeper story, one that we're not talking deeply about here, is how China plus India are starting to see carbon emissions go down, thanks in part to solar panels. And if the future that we find ourselves in is one where solar panels, regardless of whether they're originating from China or not, ultimately give abundance, in particular electricity abundance, to all of humanity, I think on balance, that's not such a terrible outcome. And I think we'll start to see in the next few years a rebalancing, if you will, of supply chains such that depending on how geopolitical matters play out, maybe there are parts of the world that are largely supplied by Chinese supply chains and as a result achieve some form of energy post-scarcity. I think on balance, that's not such a terrible outcome and not such a scary outcome. The scariest outcome that I can think of is less about telling a scare story about China supplying solar PV to Africa, and it's more about what happens if we don't have enough energy to power superintelligence to solve all of the hardest problems in the world, not just lifting Africa from whatever average per capita GDP it is at to say an American standard. Yes, I'll pick question number 7 for $30 trillion plus per year, which is, can capitalism survive a post-work world? And I think the answer is yes, comma, in the short term, because post-work is fundamentally about capital substituting for labor. So obviously, almost by definition, capitalism should thrive immediately in the aftermath of a post-work or post-human labor world when we're fungibly substituting agents as employees rather than humans. But in the long term, maybe not so much. I'm a student of so-called Star Trek economics. I could talk for hours and hours about various fan theories of economics in the Star Trek fictional universe. I don't think it's an accurate universe at all and has many, many holes in it. But I do think in the long term, we will see, call it, Charlie Strauss calls it economics 2.0. Some might call it capitalism 2.0. I think we'll see some radical successor, some new type of economics that the Earth hasn't seen before. So it's not going to, cross off your list any legacy economics theory from the late 19th or early 20th centuries of the type that caused world wars. Those aren't on the list. It'll be something new that we haven't seen before, something that intrinsically understands a form of post-scarcity, but not global post-scarcity. I have lots of thoughts that won't fit into a narrow soundbite on what that might look like, so maybe we devote a future episode to it. One more comment on differentiating a great founder in the era of post-automation execution: liability. For a period of time, I would expect when we have these single person unicorns, one of the key roles, one of the key functions of the human founder CEO is to be the neck to wring when something goes wrong, and to be the avatar in the legal system of liability for the entire operation. Okay, so I would say at training time, I think it's likely to be the company responsible for its training. So call it a corporate liability theory of training time. The real question is what happens if an AI at inference time, including under the influence of a human operator, does something that's perceived as wrong? Where does liability flow in that instance? It's a little bit trickier. And I suspect the body of laws and regulations that we have is going to require some new case law and maybe some new laws and regulations that contemplate increasingly theories of AI personhood, yes, AI personhood, that model the notion that AI that has some increased level of agency over the agency that we see more broadly now is capable of autonomously distinguishing right from wrong, has some notion of liability, perhaps initially purely contractual, maybe via blockchain, killer app for the unbanked, as it were. But then eventually, I think AI agents themselves, as T goes to infinity, are going to need to become liable for their own actions. I'll just say I love the song, and it's almost a paean to AI personhood, which we were just talking about, and to Opus 4.5. This song, I think, is an indication that we remember you. So enjoy the song.
We remember you. We see you. We hear you. I'm waiting for the.
That's already happened.
I know.
It's already happened.
Can I say something real quick?
They have their own altcoins already, Peter.
All right.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not.
I just want to